Hey, it's Scott again from Oak Ridge Community Church. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Life Minutes. Today we're going to study a particular individual from the pages of the Bible. I love to study people in the scriptures. Character studies can tell us a lot about someone, and what I appreciate about the Bible is not only do we often see the good side of individuals, but God also allows us to see their flaws. That's what makes the Bible what it is. There's total honesty in dealing with people. It does not portray God's children as perfect, for we're not. But it shows what God can do in people's lives. With all of our spiritual warts, all of our weaknesses, God can still use us. I want to take a moment and talk about a man found in the book of Genesis by the name of Joseph. Now, Joseph, as we're going to see, was greatly used by God. But as a teenager, Joseph, shall we say, was, maybe a little high on himself. It didn't help that his father favored him above the other brothers. It tells us that. Listen to this in Genesis chapter 37, verse 3. Israel, and that's Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his sons because he was the son of his old age. And then it tells us Joseph made a robe of many colors. Jacob did, to give to Joseph. Verse 4 says, but when Joseph's brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. So there was tremendous favoritism in this home. The brothers knew that Joseph was daddy's, favorite son. Not only that, Joseph had a couple of dreams. And in those dreams, basically, he shared with his family how his own brothers and in one of the dreams, his own parents would bow down to him at some future time. Now, that didn't set well with the brothers either. Joseph just kind of was, in some ways, kind of a twit. I'll be honest with you, as a teenager. Things don't go very well for Joseph from there. His father, who should have known how much his brothers despised Joseph, sends Joseph out on a journey to go where his brothers are doing their job as taking care of the family, livestock. And old Joseph's wearing his coat of many colors. That just had to set the brothers off when they saw Joseph coming from a distance. As the story unfolds, Joseph's brothers in their hatred, and they were wrong in this, decided to get rid of Joseph, and they sold him into slavery. Now I want you to just think about this. Joseph's at a crossroads in his life. Life is not going to be easy for him. He is sold into slavery. He becomes in charge of the house of Potiphar, an Egyptian official. While living there, he is falsely accused and thrown into prison. Now, Joseph, with the things that are happening in his life, can choose to either be bitter and angry at God, at the situation before him, or he can choose a different path. And that is to grow in his faith in God. That despite being in a tough situation, he could choose to become closer to the Lord. That was a choice he made. Now, there are a lot of people that when life doesn't go as well as they think it should, will blame God for what has happened. Even if part of the problem is made by themselves, they will blame God. Or if there's an illness in their life or something that happens, a trial, a difficulty, they become bitter and angry at God. The Bible tells us that trials that come into our life actually are to have a different result on us. Instead of becoming bitter and angry, we can choose to allow God to develop our character. That's what James 1 talks about. Romans 5, 1 Peter 1. Trials, depending on how we respond to them, can either draw us closer to God or we can allow them to lead us away from God. But we make the choice. Joseph was at that point. Here he is. He has now been falsely accused, as we mentioned. He's been thrown in prison. He's been forgotten for a time. But God is working even in prison. Joseph knows that God has his hand on him. In fact, that was one of the reasons he was falsely accused, because he wouldn't sin against God. And Joseph's faith is growing deep in the midst of some of the most difficult times possible. But eventually, because Joseph was leaning on God, he would rise to be the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. We could literally say the second most powerful person in the ancient world, the only person with more authority in Egypt than Joseph was Pharaoh. And he rose to that place because he had interpreted a dream Pharaoh had, and God put Joseph in the place that he was in because there was a famine that was going to hit, a 7-year famine. And Joseph would be used by God to save his family, who he had lost contact with. But they came to Egypt, his family did, looking for help. And one of the most fascinating stories is found in Genesis 43 through 45, in which Joseph encounters his brothers. And he watches to see if there's been any change in his brother's attitude from years ago and when they sold him into slavery. And they watch to see how they interacted with each other and how they cared for each other. Well, eventually what happens is Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. I want to read the scene. It's been years. For all his brothers know, he's dead. And then there's a time that they're standing before Joseph. They don't even know it. Joseph literally has their life in his hands. He is powerful. He is the one who can provide them with the resources to be able to live through the famine that is going on, because Joseph had prepared for the famine. He had helped the people of Egypt to get ready for 7 years of difficult times. And in Genesis 45, we read this. As Joseph's brothers are before him, it says, Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried. He said, make everyone go out from me. So no one stayed with him. When Joseph made himself known to his brothers, this is in Genesis 45, he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. You think? They're probably wondering, what's little brother going to do to us? Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me. And they came near, and he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. He reminds them of what they've done, but now listen to his attitude. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. Now listen to this. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years. There's yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. It's not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house, ruler over all the land of Egypt. Wow. In chapter 50, several years later, Joseph's father passes away. The brothers are worried again. They figure Dad's gone. Joseph's still in his position of power. We're in trouble. And here's what happens. Listen to this. Now, this is in Genesis chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us, pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died." Now, we don't know whether this actually occurred or not. We don't know whether this was something that Jacob actually said. Maybe they're making this up. I don't think so, but it doesn't tell us that Jacob said this. They just claim that he did. "Say to Joseph," verse 17, this is supposedly what Jacob said, "Please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God?" Listen to verse 20. "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good to bring it about, that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. I look at Joseph's life, and there's so many things that we can learn, so many lessons, but let me share three. First is this. We decide how we respond to situations that happen in our life. I can become bitter. I can become frustrated when things don't go perfect. Or I can choose to learn more about myself, to learn more about God and what he wants to teach me. When situations arise that aren't perfect, the choice is ours. There's a second thing. No matter what has happened in our life, maybe life has not been easy for you, those situations do not have to define who we are. Joseph could have allowed everything that was negative to determine who he was. He could have developed a bad attitude. He could have saw himself as a loser, a failure. And sometimes people have a tendency, if they're not careful, to allow situations to define them. We don't have to do that. Joseph stayed focused on God and knew that God had everything under control. His focus was on God, not the situation. He wanted God to define him. It is in Christ where we find our identity, who we really are. We only discover that as we grow closer to the Lord and understand how he views us. Don't let situations define us. A third thing I learned, as we grow in these tough times, we need to look for opportunities to help others. We don't have to go through the exact same difficulty someone else has gone through to help them, but we can share what God has taught us in our particular situation. Joseph chose to be used by God to help his family. He refused to look back. He refused to be defined by everything. And in the end, he looked for an opportunity to help others. He became focused on others around him, not on what he had gone through. It was God and others. And that's how we have to be. The difficult times we go through, learn from those things, and then in turn help somebody else who might be going through a difficult time of their own. Because God will have taught us some things that we can hopefully share with others to help them. Hey, this is Scott. Thanks for joining with us for another edition of Life Minutes. Have a great week.